Hello, and welcome to IAB Pulse, our regular video news show where we discuss the hottest trends and most important topics in the digital advertising industry today. I'm Angelina Eng, your host, VP of IAB's Measurement, Adjustability, and Data Center. And today we will be discussing Made for Advertising, aka MFAs. And there's been a lot of recent trade coverage on ads being served on MFAs or in MFA-like pages. And though we need to fix this as an industry, we want to make sure that we don't create guidelines that penalize publishers who don't primarily practice MFA tactics. Today, we're talking about how we got here, where the line is between MFA and legitimate publishers, and what we as an industry can do to remedy this. So joining me today to discuss this topic is Scott Cunningham, Tech Publishing, Advertising, Executive and Consulting of Cunningham Tech Consultant, and famously known as one of the founders of IAB Tech Lab, and Rob Beeler, founder and CEO at Beeler.tech, formerly of AdMonsters and Golf.com. Guys, welcome to the virtual stage.
Thanks for having us.
Looking forward to it.
All right, so we've known each other a long time, and we've been having some conversations about this, especially over the last several months. And let's talk first about the state of MFAs and how we got here. So Rob, I'm going to look to you first. Why are MFAs actually attractive to buyers? And why does that lead to the existence of MFA?
Yeah, well, as to whether they're actually attractive to advertisers and buyers is part of the issue here, right? Because if you are essentially checking a box and just trying to say, hey, I've been able to reach an audience very cheaply, that audience is out there. Whether it's the correct audience or not, in the right place or not, that's a separate question. That isn't what is being asked. Some people are just being asked to kind of buy media, and I think that that's where they get in trouble. And wherever there is demand, people are going to create supply. And so a lot of companies have come up with ways to create these made for advertising or made for arbitrage websites to essentially capture money that flows freely into the system without a lot of guidelines around them to make sure that they that buy winds up in the right places.
Got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, there's a difference between marketing and media investment. And the KPIs with media investment are things like viewability. And over time and over the years, those KPIs for media investment professionals, they needed to meet those goals. And, interestingly enough, their algorithms of their DSPs or their demand side platform tools have been tuned for these things too. And what we found was that websites could be created that catered to these KPIs. And candidly, this is how we got there. Now the question becomes, do the media investment folks actually see the outcomes that they're looking for beyond maybe those rudimentary KPIs? I think that's where the interesting questions end up.
So Scott, you're talking about a much larger issue, right? Throughout the supply chain and supply chain inequality, the lack of transparency. Let's elaborate into this, right? So volume, the clients are looking for volume at a low cost. MFAs are a result of cheap reach or more efficient reach, if you will. Pubs are forced to add more ad units to their site, but that doesn't make them MFAs, right?
The publishers, from the perspective of the publisher side, legitimate publishers, obviously they're kind of beholden to the same KPIs as an MFA site if the media investment professional is the buyer. Again, those KPIs such as viewability, low cost volume acquisition of inventory. That's what the buy side is looking for in the media investment arm. And all you have to do is prove to your CFO, hey, look how much reach I got. Look at the frequency I got. Look at the viewability I got. But that really lend itself to consumers and engagement and conversions and brand uplift. And the publishers, the legitimate publishers out there, because CPMs have been driven into to the bottom, if you will, and they continue to be lowered, legitimate publishers are saying, well, look, if those are the KPIs for media investment, then I'm just going to add more ad units to the page. The question becomes, is that truly an MFA or a legitimate publisher who's layered up their ad site with too many ad units from an ad density perspective. And I think this is where the conundrum is because a lot of legitimate publishers, they've risked running afoul of being labeled MFA under certain KPIs and distinctions. But overall, I think this is where Rob and I agree. If you take a look at totality of all those attributes of what constitutes potentially an MFA, legit publishers should stay clear of that.
You know, if you think about it, a publisher can have three types of clients on the buy side: the DSP, an agency, or an advertiser slash marketer, right? And so if the ultimate goal is to have widgets fly out of your store because someone saw an online ad, you're measuring conversions at that level. But that's not exactly how they work with an agency or or a DSP who use other mechanisms to try to find the right audience by which to convert. And sometimes it kind of stops short of getting to the conversion and seeing that it actually reached people who wind up converting. Instead, you just check off boxes in terms of these other metrics. And that, again, rises to people being able to rise this. Now, are publishers, MFAs? Well, I'd like to think in one sense, we should be like proud of that we serve advertising. I mean, I'd love to say that I was made for advertising. Unfortunately, I've been told I do not have a face for advertising, but there is a piece of this of just having the ability to deliver good advertising is a good part of a user experience, right? In the right place, a relevant ad is a part of the user experience for the publisher. But, publishers have short-term goals too, and they need to meet the numbers. And if they're, predominantly programmatic, you kind of go where the market drives you, which unfortunately is down. And that's part of the conversation we need to have to get above that MFA line.
Yeah, I mean, so Rob, you had me host a workshop at one of your events, Feeler Tech Navigator. There were about 30 publishers in this one workshop where we talked about the fine line between what constitutes an MFA and what doesn't. And it was interesting to hear from these 30 plus publishers about how there might be some double standards when it comes to, things like, I think the characteristics of an MFA include driving traffic to their website or having multiple ads from the same advertiser on the pages. Listicles, featuring listicles are where a lot of these tactics, I think, have been around for ages, but where do we draw the line? And like, what is this really? Is it a technical thing? Is it an aesthetic thing?
There's an aspect that I'll take one approach to this. It's kind of the publisher and the publisher's job to know their audience, right? Like ultimately, if you have a premium publishing brand, right? First of all, you should be able to market just like marketers market. I should be able to get people to my website. It feels a little unfair that I don't get to do that. I have to rely on search and social, which by the way have given up on us. So can I at least buy some traffic? Now, there's some things to that, and I just kind of made a big broad statement there. But there's also an aspect of going, people consume the content that they want to consume. So if you care about what the 80s stars you grew up with look like now, by all means, go look, right? Like, and if I want to be the one that creates that, that's fine. But ultimately, when it comes down to creating premium experiences online, publishers have to think like brands themselves and realize they need to get the right consumer in and give them a good experience. And I think that that's the part where we've allowed the market to dictate to publishers what the rules are. And while I will say the open marketplace, the open web is a messy place, I prefer having more voices than I do to have fewer voices because of drawing a line which is somewhat maybe arbitrary. There may be other ways to solve this than to just sit there and start to dictate, hey, publishers, you can't do this or that. I think there's some other ways for us to have that conversation, and hopefully we can have those.
Well, one of the outcomes was around developing standards and some guidelines, right? Perhaps like best practices or suggestions. Scott, having been a founder over at IAB Tech Lab, do you think, and obviously the creation of the Trustworthy Accountability Group, TAG, right? If there was some standards and guidelines created, do you think that pubs would agree to getting audited and perhaps getting some sort of weighted score to enable buyers to feel more confident about their content and their website?
Yeah, I mean, look, first, let me articulate, I don't agree with Rob at all. His face is made for advertising.
Absolutely not.
Just want to set that clear. But the interesting delta on this conversation came from the 4As and the ANA when they released the made for arbitrage distinction on top of this. And the criteria that came out in the fall on this topic was, traffic acquisition, ad density, ad refresh, crappy looking sites. And so they kind of gave a lot of credence to, all of these things need to be working in concert with one another in order to create this distinction of made for arbitrage. And I think that actually helped the market. And then what happened was on the standards track was that the MRC just recently released that criteria when it came to the IVT guidelines. They did an addendum release on that. Now, let's be clear. I love the analogy that was out there that says that MFA and IVT ad fraud, they're not the same thing, but they are coming from and live in the same neighborhood. And so this aspect of the MRC guidelines is actually really important. And the reason is in section 4.1.1, I'm going to go in the weeds, people should look it up. Publishers have a right to knock on the door of verification providers and understand why they've been blocked for MFA or any other criteria. This is the reconciliation portion of the MRC. Publishers do not exercise this enough. Oftentimes, publishers are kind of flying blind to why they've been blocked. Now, I do think that along that lines of the standards and the creation around these things is that Rob is right, and this is where I do agree with him, that publishers, if they're focusing on quality consumer experiences around their content, their product, their ad experiences, including the monetization, including beholden to the ad refresh rate of the IAB Tech Lab, then they should be in the clear. There is really, if you add up all of these distinctions of ad refresh, ad density, no original content, too much purchase traffic. And some, in the eye of the beholder is somebody from the publisher side might say, hey, look, purchase traffic, that to us is marketing. That's how we actually, that's social marketing. That's how we acquire additional audiences outside of our organic. So what is the right line? It's the totality of those criteria. And so moving forward, I think a couple scenarios play themselves out. One is the Brand Safety Institute is putting together their pub portal with these verification vendors. So the publisher can put in their domain and say, have I been flagged? Okay. The Trustworthy Accountability Group has also come out with some blocking criteria and guidelines on blocking for buyers to say, look, if you're going to put together a block list, including which potentially would be a MFA block list, you should have a start and end date against those things so that you're constantly reevaluating your blocking of these things. I'm not a huge fan of blocking. I like the inclusion list route with some caveats to that. But that's what TAG is doing on that front. And I think that the IAB Tech Lab and maybe even the Coalition for Better Ads has a role in making sure that their standards are being broadcast. Now, there is one element here of while those are standards bodies, they're issuing these type of criteria. Who's the enforcer? And I think this goes back to the publisher. Is there a mechanism by which a publisher can be graded with that gold star? And the reality is right now there is not. It is based on the verification companies, whether you're flagged or not. I would love to see an Alliance for Audited Media or an AAM or some other body come up with that totality. And if the buyers say, yeah, we'll buy against that type of quality criteria, then yeah, the publishers, they should want to go through that. But I will say that the publishers They will not go through that if that gold star is not recognized by the buy side. So that's kind of where we're at with the enforcement, I believe, of some of the criteria that's come out.
And
Well, I think the other thing to think about though is this the cost of such, you know, notoriety or a stamp of approval. Is this something that needs to be reevaluated once a year? But the other thing I think is important to call out is I think it's a bit challenging for small to medium sized publishers, especially minority owned local news sites, right? So where aesthetically their site may not fit the right look and feel that most brands may want to have their ads be aligned with. And a lot of these sites don't have the resources or the funds to redesign their website. And they're losing out on revenue right now. So they're looking for additional sources, such as you mentioned, adding new ad units onto their website. They could be native ads. And so I think there's a fine line between an MFA and a regular site. I guess how, Rob, in your perspective, what is some advice that you have for publishers when it comes to dealing with that with the buy side?
one quick thing, because I know you're conscious of time. The thing that Scott said that was so key is the reward. The reward for building the right things. Buyers can decide where they buy. You can't build a standard and say you have to buy these sites. They get to choose any individual site they want to or not. That's up to them. But we need to create a system where publishers are rewarded for doing the right things and not going to as close to MFA as possible. And again, we're both kind of playing this game there. So, I mean, the advice underneath all of this is the only way to future proof as a publisher is to build around your audience. You give them a bad experience, they're not coming back. There's an infinite amount of other choices. Okay. So the fact that you could try and get someone and have them come back is something that it's actually a monumental task, right? It is hard to get them back unless you've built yourself up as a publisher brand. I think that's one key thing. But there's an aspect of going like, stop going into the darkest places of the internet to buy stuff. Inclusion lists, as Scott said. And then again, premium publishers shouldn't even be part of this conversation. They should just be above this all. Just in terms of again, the way they treat their users and their buyers. So hopefully all of these things lead to the steps where advertising is going into the right places and being successful and performing.
I think, to piggyback on that with the local news and then also the diverse owned media that Angelina you're referencing, standards are a floor. They're not the ceiling of the best outcomes. They are a floor capabilities. And if we do this right, that floor does separate itself from the made for arbitrage systems. And then those smaller publishers, their sites might not be the greatest, but they've met the ad experience criteria. They've met the original content criteria. And I think that's all what we need around that. And candidly, the barrier of entry should not be that great in order to do this. If you actually take a look at the criteria of made for arbitrage and you add up all those things, when you look at a certain site or subdomain, maybe I'll say, if it's an arbitrage system, the game that's going on that front. It's just unfortunate. A lot of these small sites, you look at it, it's like, ooh, that looks like a roadblock for the local bar around the corner and stuff like that. Well, guess what? That's not an MFA. That's a roadblock for the local bar around the corner. It has 3 ad units and maybe a top brand doesn't want that ad experience. That's fine. It's not an arbitrage play. Let's be clear on that front.
Terrible websites will continue to exist. Okay, sorry. And while we can give them lessons and we can go out there and do it, it's just kind of a nature of the beast and so forth. And I think that there's an aspect. I mean, look, creating content should be a thriving business. I mean, I've yet to see anything that says people are done with the internet. They've moving on to something else. So right now we should all be doing extremely well. The key here is that we've created systems by which it's almost like these things are being used to push things down to the lowest common denominator. And I think in that process, we're keeping the open marketplace messier than it needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that rather than having, I think there's lots of questions and lots of requests for please standardize and define MFAs. And I think it's really difficult to do that when there is that gray line and perhaps where the bad guys can game the system. I think where we need to do, or what needs to happen, is some sort of scoring mechanism, Scott, as you mentioned, where we're looking at various different criteria. So add to content ratio, the number of refreshes, the aesthetics. But I think what most important is understanding the audience, as you mentioned, but also the content, right? So is it engaging content? Are people actually converting from those websites? I think when it comes to outcomes, oftentimes some of those sites are actually very effective and really efficient at driving outcomes. And that's where I think buyers need to be cautious and take careful consideration of who and what types of sites that they put on this inclusion list versus exclusion list.
I'll throw one thing to you for us to think about. It's something near and dear to your heart, Angelina, is attention metrics.
Oh, I love attention metrics.
So attention metrics, if you think about it, might lead you to think about having larger ads, which is against the ad to content ratio. This is about really, I mean, sorry, the internet is old enough, digital advertising is old enough that we should be able to start to all get into a room and start to draw up exactly how certain things need to align. And if you want a different experience, you can have it, but you can't get penalized for it if you're meeting the needs of your buyers and your audiences. Like you just shouldn't be penalized for that. So that's the part that we need to sit there and figure out. It's in everyone's best interest, maybe not everyone's best interest. Let's just say for most of us, best interest is making sure the open internet continues to exist.
I think that ad experience right there, there was a time where we had interstitials, we had, elegant, larger ad units. And I think the industry went and the pendulum swung too far to the other direction, taking a look at this ad density of 40%, which was some of the criteria that came out there, because some of those larger ad units can be very instructional. They can actually convert very nicely. And candidly, they are, high impact, high value. And that value proposition to a consumer to have to wait for it is 10, 15 seconds. We got rid of those because of our concerns around ad blocking. That as an industry, that's where we ended up. Well, now look at where we've ended up. We've actually looked at some of these websites who say, all right, well, it might be 40 to 50%, but I got 9 ad units. It looks like the Vegas Strip. And I would say we took that pendulum and swung it really hard the wrong direction. And I think we need to come back to Rob's point of what are the elegant ad units that will perform and that will drive publisher revenue up and frankly drive conversions for those buyers.
And insertion orders through fax machines, three martini lunches, the old days. Scott, our time will return.
So I think, Scott, I think you just kind of called out and you want Paperboy back, Unicast ads back. I'm all for it.
I didn't want to use the names. But I am a big fan of the old school. It was their elegant classics. Yes, that's me.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
Yep.
guys, this has been a fascinating conversation. Always a pleasure. So thank you very much. I want to say thank you to my guest, Scott Cunningham, Rob Beeler, for joining us here today. And thank you to our viewers and listeners for leaning in.